Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Cold Winter's Night by Kathryn Le Veque, narrated by Paul Woodson. Prologue. Year of our Lord 1230. Septentrion Castle, Northumberland, the month of August. Swoosh! Something flew over his head. He thought it was a club, but he couldn't be sure. All he knew was that there were several men in the smelly, dingy stable, and he was cornered, backed up by his black stallion, who, sensing a fight, was beginning to kick. They'd caught him off guard. Now, cornered in the stall of the low-ceilinged stable at his ancestral home of Septentrion Castle, he was without his sword or any other manner of weapon. But he managed to grab an iron hoof-pick. He'd just been using it on his horse. He wasn't sure what was going on, or why he'd been struck heavily on the back with something that knocked the wind out of him, but he could guess. They may get him in the end, but he could do a lot of damage with that pick before it was over. He braced himself. It was dark in the corner of the stable, but he could see men moving around. He could hear their weapons clanging, the dull sound of metal reverberating as they were unsheathed. There were swords drawing close, and he lifted the pick, slashing it at the first man who came near. He made contact with the man's neck, driving the hoof-pick through it. The man gurgled and groaned, falling aside, as he yanked out his pick and swung it again, this time into the shoulder of another man, catching him in the collarbone. The man cried out in pain, and he yanked on him, pulling the man against him. "Stow your weapons," he commanded. "Stow them, or by God I shall use this fool as a shield, and you can stick your swords into him and not me. If you do not care, then go forth. But no, I will take as many of you as I can with me." That seemed to bring some pause as the man in his grip moaned in agony. When everyone seemed to be indecisive, he yanked out the pick and drove it into the man again, this time into his other shoulder. As the man cried out with pain, someone stepped forward in the darkness, lifting his hands in a gesture of surrender. But it was no surrender. This was the moment that demands would be made. "Gage, stop." It was a soft male voice. "There is no need for bloodshed. We can calmly reason through this situation." Sir Gage de Reyne recognized the voice. He didn't even have to see his brother's face in the darkness. Even before he spoke, he knew that his elder and only brother was the driving force behind the ambush. He glanced down at the man in his grip, the one he'd stabbed twice, and noticed that it was a soldier he'd known for years. He'd considered the man a friend, or at least he had until this moment. When their eyes met, the soldier smiled wanly. "I've come to help you, Gage," he said. "You didn't let me speak." Gage looked at the man in horror. His pick was still in him, and he yanked it free, pushing the soldier back towards the group that was converging on him. He wielded the pick threateningly. "I was hoping you would speak to me brother to brother before you went through with your usual hasty and reckless decisions, but I see that I was wrong," he said, seeking out his brother in the dim light. "You do not need a mob of soldiers who we have both known most of our lives. All you had to do was speak to me, Booth." Sir Booth de Reyne, Lord Stagshaw, stepped forward, his dusky eyes fixed on his younger, smarter, more handsome and far more talented brother. Gage was all of those things. Gage was the knight all knights aspired to be, a man with morals and ethics, strength and skill. He was everything Booth wasn't. And Booth wanted him gone. "I am speaking to you," he said evenly. "It is time that we speak, but you cannot blame me for wanting to protect myself from what will be your undoubted rage on the subject. There have been times in the past when you have been, shall we say, violent." Gage knew that, indicated by the hoof-pick in his hand. In this case it was self-defense, even though Booth had a talent for pushing him beyond his endurance. In times past, their father had always been there to break up the fights, and it was always Gage with the upper hand because Booth would rather feast, drink, carouse, and scheme than actually put in the time necessary to become a decently skilled knight. Therefore Gage could fight, and Booth really couldn't. Their father had known this, and Gage, by virtue of his character, had always been his favourite. Booth knew this, which was why their father's unexpected passing 2 weeks earlier had thrown Booth into survival mode. What he couldn't control, he would erase, one way or another. That meant his brother, and Gage was well aware. "I will not lower the pick," Gage said after a moment. "You have armed men all around me. I am allowed to defend myself from whatever it is you have ordered them to do." Booth looked at the bleeding soldier, the others who were armed, all of them looking uncertain and, in truth, unhappy. He knew it was because Gage was well liked, and they took orders from him much more readily than they did from Booth. But that was until their father had died. Now they had no choice but to obey the new Lord Stagshaw. "Gage," Booth said seriously, focused on his brother, "you've seen dogs in a pack, how they all respond to one dominant male." Gage's dark blue eyes glittered. "What is your point?" "That there can only be one dominant male," Booth said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I realize that Septentrion is your home and that you were born here, but now it is time for you to leave. Septentrion is my property now, and the Stagshaw barony belongs to me, and there is no place for you. You must find your own way in life." Gage had known this moment was coming. Ever since their father had breathed his last, he knew this was coming. Booth had remained purposely aloof from him, shutting him out of any decisions for their ancestral home, sending missives off to local allies and not telling his brother about the contents. He had a suspicion as to why, because Booth was just that crafty, and just that insecure. Now all of that secrecy was finally being revealed. "I see," Gage said coolly, "and I shall find my own way. You needn't concern yourself. There are plenty of local allies that—" Booth cut him off. "You will not serve in Northumberland." Gage's brow furrowed. "Not in Northumberland," he repeated. "Why not?" Booth shrugged. "Northumberland is where my property is, and I do not wish for you to serve anywhere near me." Gage stared at him in shock before an idea occurred to him. "I understand completely," he said. "Is it because I might tell your allies the truth about you? How you cheat, lie, beg, or steal to get what you want? I have a revelation for you, brother. They already know. Father told them long ago. He told them to be wary of you. So whatever you've been doing since Father's death has gone largely ignored, I am sure. Septentrion is not to be trusted now, and everyone knows it. You've done that." The smug expression drained from Booth's face. "If I have bridges to repair, then I shall do it without you," he hissed. "A kingdom can only have one king, and that is me. Get out, and find your own way in the world, Gage. I do not want you here, and if you do not leave peacefully, I shall make sure you are thrown from Septentrion by force. A hoof-pick is not going to prevent my men from carrying out their orders." Even though Gage knew everything had been leading up to this moment, it was still painful. This was his home, and he had been born here. His family had been at Septentrion Castle for several generations, occupying that old castle with the Roman tile floors in the solar and the ancient wall of the Romans that ran alongside the property. This far north there were remains of the Romans everywhere, and no more obvious than at Septentrion. In fact, the very name was from the ancient Roman name of the fort upon which the castle was built, Porta Septentrionalis, the North Gate. And now he was to be turned out by a suspicious, greedy brother. He wouldn't admit that he had nowhere to go. Sure, he had friends throughout England and even in Wales, but he was basically being cast out of his home, and that was a humiliating thing for any man. Moreover, he was a de Reyne, and de Reynes always stuck together. Their family bonds were legendary. But not for the sons of Hart de Reyne. Perhaps that was the most difficult thing of all. "You do realize that I was born here, just like you," he said through clenched teeth, trying desperately to sound like he wasn't begging. You do realize that this is my home as much as it is yours. A generous and good lord would utilize my strengths, not find himself threatened by them. I am not threatened. I simply do not want you here. Because I am the voice of reason, and you are a pitiful wretch. A pitiful wretch who is the rightful lord of Septentrion. That was as far as Gage intended to go without pleading, but inside he was in turmoil. He could charge his brother and kill him, but that would make him just as bad as Booth was. He would be doing what his brother feared, destroying him to assume command of Septentrion. That would make him the villain, and he was quite certain the army would never look at him the same way. Or perhaps they would understand and be on his side. Still, he couldn't take that chance. He had to do what honor dictated. He had to go. "Then you are welcome to it," he said, tossing aside the iron pick. "I hope it is everything you hoped it would be, brother. My only regret is that greed will choke you in the end, and I will not be here to see it. Now let me collect my things, and I will be gone before the sun sets." Booth looked at him as if he had expected more of a fight. "Good," he said after a moment. "You will take only what you can carry on your horse." "I own 3 horses. I will take all 3, or you really will have a fight on your hands." Truth be told, even Booth wasn't stupid enough to invite a fight when they could emerge from this situation relatively peacefully. But he was disappointed. Disappointed he couldn't make his proud brother plead. "Then take them," he said. "Take all of the reminders of your time here at Septentrion with you. I do not want to see any remnants." "You won't." "And that is all you have to say to me?" "What more do you want me to say that has not already been said?" Booth seemed to be growing more annoyed. His lips were twitching as if he wanted to say something more. It took Gage a moment to realize that his brother wanted him to beg. He wanted to see Gage lose his composure and beg for his place in the world, but Gage wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. He had no idea where he was going to go or what he was going to do, but he knew this moment would come, so he'd had some choices in his mind. Now it was a matter of making his selection, and leaving the only life he'd ever known. With nothing more to say to his brother, he turned back to his stallion to groom the horse and prepare him to depart. He was ending the conversation on his terms, effectively shutting out Booth, who may have entered the stable with the upper hand, but who definitely didn't leave with it. Gage may have been leaving, but he'd had the last word. Without being instructed by Booth, the soldiers disbanded. Gage could hear his brother growling, yelling at the men who had left the stable before he'd given them permission, accusing them of desertion. He ordered several of them back into the stable, to shadow Gage as the man collected his possessions for departure. A few soldiers returned, including the man Gage had sunk his hoof-pick into, to not only shadow Gage but to help him gather his things. They prepared his other horses while Gage and 2 men went into the keep so he could pack his possessions. No matter how aggrieved Gage was feeling, he did everything with his head held high. There wasn't one soldier at Septentrion who expected less. One man who also didn't expect less was the only other knight at the castle, Sir Lawrence de Veque. They called him the Bull, or simply Bull, for the sheer size of his arms and shoulders, but also for a peculiar habit he had in battle. Entering a fight, he'd lower his head like a bull charging, and use those shoulders to mow people down. Lawrence wasn't a tall man, but what he didn't have in height he made up for in power and breadth. He was older, with dark blonde hair that was grey at the temples, and he was a close friend to Gage. He too knew what was going to happen when Gage de Reyne took command. It had only been a matter of time, and that time had come. He'd seen the new Lord Stagshaw heading to the stables earlier that evening with a group of armed men, and knowing that Gage was in there, he was concerned for Gage's safety. He'd come off the wall and armed himself, heading to the stables to defend Gage if need be, but he'd missed what fight there was. Still, he'd stood poised by the door listening to the conversation, knowing that Booth was finally banishing his younger and far more noble brother from Septentrion. Lawrence had already made the decision what he was going to do when that happened. He had been with Gage de Reyne for many years. He'd seen the brothers de Reyne grow up, and he'd seen what a shining star Gage had become. The man who would have made a magnificent lord was a man without a home now, and when Gage departed his place of birth with 3 horses, several satchels, saddlebags, and more, Lawrence joined him. He hated Booth more than Gage did, and had only remained at Septentrion after the death of Hart because of Gage. But if Gage was leaving, so was he. He wasn't going to let Gage go alone. Under a full moon, the 2 knights travelled south, heading towards London, and a world of opportunity for 2 seasoned warriors worth their weight in gold. Gage hoped to return home someday, but it wouldn't be to beg his brother to take him back. It would be to destroy him. He wasn't sure how he would return, but he would. Perhaps that had been his problem all along. He'd respected the brotherly bonds that Booth hadn't. He detested his brother, but he was still his brother. That bloodline alone warranted some mercy, but Gage realized that had been his mistake. He shouldn't have shown any mercy at all when dealing with Booth, because that kind of mercy had been a weakness. He knew that now. Men took advantage of men with weaknesses, and as a seasoned knight he should have known that. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. Emotions had gotten him into trouble in the first place. He'd felt something for his only sibling, for his home in general, and now all of it was gone, ripped away, leaving an open wound where his tender heart used to be. But no more. He was going to have to learn to replace the blood in his veins with ice. Chapter 1. Ashleven Castle, Northumberland, the month of September.
And God said, "Kill your son to prove your love of the Lord."
The audience was spellbound as the words came booming from a young woman wearing a white beard made from scratchy, uncombed wool, held on her face with a string around the top of her head. She wore a red cloak around her shoulders, deliberately dirtied, and she was holding another young woman down on a makeshift altar fashioned from stone and wood. Something grim was happening smack in the center of a delicate lady's solar, as the young woman clutched a glittering dagger in one hand, holding it aloft.
At God's command, Abraham bound his son to the altar and promised to kill him until an angel of the Lord appeared.
On cue, yet another young woman dressed in flowing white, with a circle of pale flowers around her head, came rushing into the chamber. But the garment was too long, and she tripped on the hem, ploughing into the young woman with the fake beard and the knife. The knife went flying as both young women crashed into the girl who had her head upon the altar. They all went down in a heap. Unfortunately, so did the painted backdrop that was supposed to represent a mountain and clouds. It was a wooden screen used by the lady of the castle from time to time, but her naughty daughters had absconded with it and painted a scene for this great performance. As the girls fell over, they crashed into the screen, and it toppled to the floor as the audience screamed with delight and surprise. It was an audience full of girls, none of them more than 16 years of age, and they leapt to their feet as the performers collapsed to the ground. They thought it was marvelous. But it wasn't so marvelous, because it wasn't planned. The young woman with the fake beard ended up at the bottom of the pile, enraged that her performance had been scuttled. The audience was laughing as they pulled the girls off of her, declaring their delight for the riveting tale of Abraham and Isaac. But the young woman at the bottom of the heap sat up, pulling the red cloak off her face as she faced her unruly audience.
"I'm not finished yet," she said loudly. "If it wasn't for the clumsy angel of the Lord, you would have seen a magnificent ending."
The angel of the Lord, otherwise known as Lady Spring de Thorington, scowled at her eldest sister and the playwright of the family.
"It was mostly over anyway," she said. "But it is your fault." "My fault?"
Spring lifted up the hem of the white garment.
"This is too long," she said. "I told you it was too long. 'Tis your fault for making me wear it, Winter."
Lady Wynter de Thorington's eyes narrowed dangerously.
"You're as ungainly as a newborn colt," she said. "Any reasonably graceful person could have worn that robe and not fallen over her own feet. Enough, ladies."
A woman in a white wimple and fine silks was suddenly between them, clapping her hands crisply.
"Wynter, get off the floor. More of your guests are arriving, so your performance is over for the day, as inappropriate as it was. You must go and change into your finery."
Wynter looked at her mother in outrage.
"Inappropriate," she repeated. "It is a story from the Bible, Mamma. How is it inappropriate?"
Marianne de Thorington, Countess of Ashington, eyed her eldest daughter with limited patience.
"I think any tale where you threaten to sacrifice your sister is quite inappropriate," she said. "Next time, do Ruth or Esther. Next time, I shall do Moses' part in the Red Sea."
Marianne cocked an eyebrow.
"As long as there are no knives and no real Egyptians in chariots," she said.
Then she pointed a long finger towards the stairwell of the keep.
"And as Moses led his people to freedom, so shall I lead you from this room with my staff to your backside if you do not do as I say. Go!"
With a sharp sigh, one showing her displeasure at a mother who had no regard for her theatrical abilities, Wynter climbed to her feet, pulling off the woolen beard that had turned her chin red with irritation. She also pulled off the scarf she'd had wrapped around her head to conceal her deep auburn mane, glorious red hair that was the envy of every woman from Berwick to Newcastle, upon the head of a young heiress who was quickly becoming the most sought-after bride in the north. In fact, that's what the celebration was all about. The excuse was Lady Wynter's 16th birthday, but the truth was that her father was taking advantage of the event to show off his daughter. Having no male children, the Earl of Ashington was going to parade his eldest daughter to the most eligible men in the north like a prized mare. The highest bidder, with the grandest family, the most wealth, and hopefully the best breeding, would be the winner of Lady Wynter Rose de Thorington and the Ashington earldom. But it was going to take a strong man to manage both. Wynter had the beauty, she had the breeding, but she was headstrong and quirky, hence the play of Abraham and Isaac. The young woman had been writing stories and acting them out since she'd been very young. Only the priests that educated her at the Brothers in God at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was quite a mouthful of a name, insisted she only act out biblical stories. They'd let her do it so long as the plays were holy. If she tried to do something different, she was met with a rap across the hands. Wynter still feared the Brothers in God, or the Mob of God, as her father called them. Nothing guaranteed they wouldn't kick down the door of Ashleven's massive keep and take a stick to her if they thought she was doing something they did not approve of. But she feared her mother more than those stick-happy monks, so she had little choice but to obey the woman's directive. Her performance for the day was most definitely ended. Unhappily dragging herself up the stairs and into the living quarters on the 2 top floors of the keep, Wynter's thoughts shifted from her ruined performance to the arriving guests. That thought alone had her moving a little faster, because there was one guest in particular she wanted to see.
"When do you think Gage is coming?"
A lass of 10 popped out of the first door at the top of the steps, her angelic face upturned. She smiled a toothy grin.
"Do you think he shall bring Bull with him?"
Wynter couldn't help but smile at her youngest sister, Autumn de Thorington. It seemed that the young girl was reading her mind.
"Who is asking about Bull?" "Me. Do you not think he is a little old for you?"
Autumn was coy. She took her sister's hand and walked with her to her chamber next door.
"He is handsome," she said. "I must marry some time, you know. Isabella of Angoulême was only 12 when she married King John, who was much older than she was."
Wynter shook her head as she entered her chamber, tossing aside the red cloak she was still holding.
"The royals always married children," she said with some disgust. "That does not make it ideal." "True, but I will be a woman in a few years. And you think Bull is going to wait for you? Will Gage wait for you?"
That brought Wynter to a halt. Speaking of Gage de Reyne always brought her to a halt. With a faint sigh, she poured a measure of rose water into a basin from a pitcher on the table. Her face was irritated from that terrible beard she had been wearing, and she splashed it with the rose water, cooling the inflamed skin.
"Gage is 10 years older than I," she finally said. "He is already a great knight."
Autumn lay on her sister's bed, sinking immediately into the feather mattress made from the finest down.
"But he has eyes for you," she said. "I know he does. I've seen the way he looks at you."
Wynter was uncomfortable with such talk. She wanted it to be true. The tall, muscular knight with the dark hair and pale, piercing eyes had garnered her attention since she'd first met him when she'd been a small girl. He'd been a youth and had briefly fostered at Ashleven Castle, and he'd taken a special interest in Wynter like the big brother she'd never had. Only from her perspective, Gage had never been brother material. He was the man she was going to marry.
"We shall see," she said, drying off her face. "Papa has invited every eligible man in Northumberland to this gathering, so mayhap there will be 1 or 2 men who cannot live without the sight of me. And you will marry then?"
Wynter looked at her, eyes glimmering with mirth.
"Gage had better be one of them."
Autumn giggled gleefully.
"He is very handsome." "Who is very handsome?"
The last de Thorington sister entered the chamber, a bundle of fabric in her arms. Lady Summer de Thorington had seen 12 years, but she had developed a decidedly female figure at a young age. She already looked like a full-grown woman in spite of her young years, an elegant lass with strawberry blonde hair and an angelic face. She was far prettier than Spring, who was blonde and somewhat plain, and looked older than even Wynter. She was well-loved, a sweet girl, if not slightly dense, but that was part of her charm. Wynter adored her.
"Gage,"
she said, watching Summer dump some freshly cleaned garments onto the bed.
"We were speaking of his comeliness."
Summer may have been a little flighty, or empty-headed like a newborn chick, as their father liked to say, but she wasn't stupid. She knew how her eldest sister lusted after the younger de Reyne son.
"He is quite comely," she agreed, shaking out a yellow silk surcoat. "I do not suppose you would like to know when he arrives?" "Of course I would."
Summer smoothed out the yellow silk casually.
"I saw de Reyne banners in the bailey a few minutes ago."
Wynter didn't react. She simply looked at her sister as the woman's words sank in. Then she let out a shriek of excitement and grabbed for the yellow silk that looked so good against her pale skin and dark red hair. She snatched it right out of Summer's hands.
"Why did you not tell me this sooner?" she demanded.
Summer grinned.
"Because we were busy with your performance," she said. "I would not dare interrupt Abraham and Isaac."
That was true. Interrupting one of Wynter's plays was a mortal offence, according to Wynter, so she tried not to appear too annoyed.
"But you did see them?" "I did."
Wynter shook out the silk.
"Then I must dress quickly and go down to greet my guests."
Summer laughed softly as she collected the soft white sheath that went underneath the surcoat.
"Guests?"
she said.
"Oh, guest."
Wynter tried to look coy, but couldn't quite manage it. As she and Summer broke down into laughter, Autumn went in search of ribbons and pins for her sister's hair.
"Hurry,"
the young girl said.
"We must help Winnie dress before Spring can get to Gage first. You know what will happen then."
Summer nodded firmly as Wynter began to strip down.
"Pain and agony for Spring," she said. "In fact, I will go and find her to make sure she does not try to corner Gage's attention."
Wynter was untying her shift so quickly that she was snagging the ties.
"If I see Spring anywhere near him, I'll—"
Summer waved her off.
"I know," she said. "Spring would do it just to spite you and then cry to Mother because you threatened her."
Ties released, Wynter yanked the worn shift over her head.
"I'll do more than threaten her," she said. "I'll tie her up and leave her for the wolves." "Would you really?"
Autumn asked, concerned. Winter's pale brown eyes were glimmering with mirth at her baby sister.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?